we'll try. Okay, so this is an introduction to JavaScripts. How many are like completely new to JavaScript, haven't coded that much at all? So pretty much everyone, that's good. I hope that my explanation answers your questions, but if you have questions on the way, just ask, and we'll see how it goes. My plan for this presentation is to just explain the basics of JavaScript, why you should learn it, how it differs from Java, because I guess some of you have some knowledge of Java. And also I will just show you some examples of applications, what you can do with JavaScript, and also some coding. Hopefully I will do most coding, so you can get an impression of how that works. And in the end, I will give some tips for further learning of JavaScript. So let's jump into it. So why should you learn JavaScript? It's just another programming language. How does it compare to other programming languages? And is it really messy and unstructured? If someone of you have heard something about JavaScript, maybe that is kind of messy and difficult to get into. So let's start with, is it just another programming language? Well, it is de facto programming language of the front-end web. It's what is mostly used. If you have used any like big web pages and any web page that has some kind of dynamic behavior, that's probably JavaScript. And it's also getting very popular on the back end through a project called Node, and also a lot of other projects coming as well. So I would say it's a very smart choice of programming language to learn, because it borrows and uses a lot of terms that's used in other languages as well. And it's very you can use it in very many varied situations. So how is it compared to Java? For those who don't know Java that well, just go along with it. Just want to explain some of the differences, like how we refer to objects. In Java, we have classes that you construct objects from, while in JavaScript, it's more prototype-based. It means that every object is like, it uses another object as a prototype, because everything is objects in JavaScript. I will explain how that actually works when I start coding. How interpretation of code is imperative, which means that you give instructions to the machine and it just reads through them and it goes through like the way you have told it to go through. Like the other way of doing that is declarative, which is like you say, I want this, and it really is up to you how you go to the logics of getting there. But in JavaScript, you have to tell everything to the browser or to the interpreter or whatever, that you do this in these kind of situations. Functional. Java now supports functional code quite well, like Lambda, if anyone knows that. In JavaScript is kind of functional. It's functional in the way that every function is a first-class citizen, which I don't know if you know what that means. It just means that you can do a lot with functions, and functions are an important part of JavaScript. I will also come back to that when it comes to code. Also, another part of the feature of JavaScript that is important to know is that it's dynamic, which means that you don't build your JavaScript code. It runs straight in the browser, and the browser takes care of the interpretation of your code. Like in Java, you usually build it to a class file or a Java file or whatever, and then you can run that file using some sort of Java runtime environment stuff. You don't need that. Everything is run straight from the code, which means that you have some downsides, because one of the things with a compiler is that you can get errors and feedback when you have like typos in your code. JavaScript doesn't really do that for you, but there are solutions for that, which I will come back to. And I guess the biggest selling point for JavaScript from my part of this is that it's native in your browsers, while Java, you need plugin, and everybody knows that Java sucks because of that. So that's when it comes down to it. That's really why I love JavaScript. And yes, there's a lot of other stuff, but I think this is confusing enough, so I'll just go on. And when it comes to complexity, yes, JavaScript has its quirks. It's really weird sometimes, and you're probably gonna scratch your head a lot. For some examples of that, you have whatthefuckjs.com, which is a really good resource to just why? And you also have a very good video just called What, and just watch it. It's fun. Also, there are a lot of cross-browser issues, especially if you're coding JavaScript for like real-world production, because then you also need to think about stuff like IE8, which is horrible, but you have to live with it. Thankfully, you have some tools for that as well, like it's called shivs, which like upgrades your browser and helps you. But then again, performance, it's just not fun, but you have to live with it. You do have a lot of resources that helps you when it comes to writing JavaScripts. You have JSLint and JSHint, which are programs that check your code. So while you don't get feedback while you are running the code, you can run it through programs like this, and they will give you hints and helpful advices. JavaScript is immensely popular, so there are very many resources out there. I would say most of the questions you have on JavaScript, you can just Google it, and you will find some solution. If it's a good solution, that's really hard to say, because there is many, well, strange stuff with JavaScript, so you just have to take it with a pinch of salt. And there's also a lot of, well, there are some testing tools that are quite good, like Karma and Buster. And yeah, if you want to do like serious JavaScript, you should really learn something called TDD, which is test-driven development. But yeah, just read up on it. There are a lot of frameworks that help you with the coding. Jquery is probably the most known. It was at least that for some years ago. Angular is very popular now. You also have Ember, and there's a lot of other stuff. I'll come back to this for a lot of other libraries and frameworks you can check. And as I previously mentioned, this presentation is on the web, so you can go through it later and check out all the links yourself. And yes, also some even have good documentations, especially those that are big and supported by big corporations like Google, stuff, Facebook, stuff like that. They have good documentation mostly. You also have some pre-compilation language options like CoffeeScript, TypeScript, and Dart. And that is, if you don't like to write JavaScript, you have alternatives when it comes to the syntax. So you can get like classes and stuff like that. The problem with those scripts, those alternatives, is they are actually compiled to JavaScript. And if you have bugs and stuff like that, you have to look through the code that are compiled from those. There are tools that can help you with that, but I won't go further into it. It's just a warning. Okay, so what can we do with JavaScript? There are a lot of things you can do, and I will highlight some of them here. Of course, the most obvious is web pages, and in a growing number, there are also apps run with JavaScript. There's this whole philosophical debate about what is an app and the different kinds of apps and stuff like that. I won't go into it. I will just mention that there are a lot of resources and libraries and stuff like that that is really helpful when you are new to JavaScript. I will also code some examples using Jquery and Angular to give you an idea of how that works. There are also games. So yeah, growing number, getting more and more. I can really recommend those two resources here. HTML5 Rocks is a very good page on it, and a lot of game engines getting out there as well. So yeah, check that out if you want to. Also, data visualizations is at least something I really like. And when it comes to that, it's really one library that stands above them all. That is d3.js. If you like visualization of data, that's the thing to check out. It has a very high learning curve. It's kind of difficult, but there are tons of examples that you can use as skeletons for your own data. So I will recommend doing that. Also check out Mike Bostock, which is one of the developers of D3. He works for, well, he contributes a lot to New York Times. So a lot of, when you see data visualizations at New York Times, he probably has made them. So he's pretty good. And robots. You can also code programs for robots that you can explain different instructions. You can give them instructions with JavaScript. I haven't worked that much with it. So my research seems that Silent.js is like the biggest of them all. You have Arduino and yeah, stuff like that. Yeah, so check it out. So let's code. I have structured the coding into 3 parts. The first, I will just go through some basic syntax so you get an idea of how that works. The second part is about how you include JavaScript into a web page. There are several ways of doing that. And last, I have an example that is an application, if you will, a clock that will count seconds. And I will show different ways of implementing that using different frameworks and libraries, and also pure JavaScript, and show you how we can make stuff easier using framework. So, variables. Variables are, well, you can declare them like this, and it's kind of straightforward, I think. To show an example of it, I will open the console, which is F12 again in your browser, and on the Mac, it's, if you want to go straight to console, you push Command Option J. So then you can write in the console. Can everyone see that? Yeah, I take that as a yes. So if I just do the first, it says undefined because asserting a variable is just, it doesn't really return anything. But if I invoke that again, it also says undefined because I didn't set it to anything. But I can then set it to 42, just a random number. It will say it has been set to 42. And of course, I can also do this with other variables. So the setting, it doesn't really return anything, but if I invoke it, it will do like this. And of course, I can add this. So yeah, it does what we expect it to do, I guess. So you can also assert strings. And that is, yeah, shown like that. That's really the essence of variables. It's not typed variables. This is like whole point of dynamic. You can, so I can say now C, we set it to a string, but now I can put it to a number. And JavaScript says, yeah, sure, do whatever you want. And this is a very powerful tool, but also very terrifying, because if you don't keep your tongue in cheek, I don't know if that's a good English explanation, but if you're not careful, you can override global variables. And when you start doing that, things get messy very quickly when you have big, complex applications. So I think I will show an example of how you can avoid that later on. The thing about the console, I can actually do just like this. I don't need to say it's a variable. It just it works like that. But it's a good thing to have var and then the name of the variable. Yeah.
Yeah. I just wanted to add that usually when you have a variable, it's best to keep it as one type, even though JavaScript allows you to change it. It can be a string or when you're using it, you should always use it as one type.
Yeah. That's so what I said is that it's important. It's smart to keep it that type that you set in the variable. It just makes life easier. Another comment?
Yeah, when you open this console, do you have to use all this a new tab, or just to make sure you don't mess with it on the web page or something?
That's really what you want to have it. You can have it like a new window. You can have it a part of the web page. It really depends on what suits you the best.
Okay, but are you able to do anything to have the web page that isn't yours, or is it just your own web page you can actually?
Well, okay. So through the console, you actually have access to all of the global variables and all of the APIs that's used by the application. So yes, you can every API is actually, you can set it to something completely different. But the only thing that will happen is that you ruin your own experience, because whatever changes you do, that will not be saved to the server. So you're not actually doing anything to anyone else. It's just your instance of that web page that you are messing up. Okay. Yeah, so that's this. It's gonna sound very funny on the screencast. That's variables. Next, functions. So functions, there are probably other ways of declaring functions as well, but these are the ones I use. Usually I use number 2, but you can see how they work. So the first one, we declare function in the beginning, and we give it the name, and then the parameters of that function, and then we declare the body of that function, which is basically what the function will do for you. So in this example, we will just sum the two parameters we declared, and we'll see how it does. So when we declare something, undefined is returned, but if we sum these two numbers, it will return 1379. If we try to sum a number and a string, it will make a string of those two, so it becomes a new string with 42 tests. So that's one way of declaring a function. The other way is to declare it as a variable that you assign a function, and then you can have basically the same. You do the same body. You sum A and B, and when you declare a variable, it's always nice to end your assignment with a semicolon. So let's see what happens. The same thing. So not that much magic in that. You also have a third way, which I recommend you to not do, because it's just horrible. But you can declare the function using the object constructor for functions. You then say new function, and you have a large F, and then you declare your parameters as strings, and your body is then the last parameter of that constructor, which you basically then tell it what it should do. So if I usually don't do this, so I might have done something wrong. Yeah, that's the same thing. So that's how you can declare your functions. As I said, use number 2. It just saves you a lot of time, because if you use the first one, JavaScript has certain ways of handling those two kind of sets. So it's just easier to stick with one. And my experience, var function name equals function is just much easier to work with. Now, there are also certain ways you can call on the function. I have shown the usual one is just to give the name and then parentheses and then the values you want to call it with. But you can also use a method on that function, which is call, and then the first value give here is what known as this, and I will explain the concept of this in the next example, where I will explain objects. But in this regard, we don't really need to give it anything. We can give it undefined. It doesn't really matter, because it doesn't use this in the function. And then this, so it does exactly the same. Now, the last way of calling a function, again, first value is this function, but it doesn't really apply in this regard. But the second parameter, we have to assign it as an array, and I will also explain arrays later on, but we can declare arrays using the square brackets, and then give the elements that the array contains, and then it gives the same. So everything does the same, but in kind of different ways, but the same value is returned using all of this. And the reason we have these kind of different ways of calling a function is because JavaScript is very flexible in how you can borrow functions from other objects, and you can basically do whatever you want given an object, and you can do whatever you call that function. Yeah, it's kind of strange, weird talking about it unless you understand other stuff, so I'll just continue on. It's just a lot of flexibility, and it's nice to know them for later. It's not really important for now. Okay, back to presentation. And the next are objects. So objects also have different ways of creating them. The simplest is the first one here. You say the name, var, name of object, equals, and then square, no, what heter det igjen? A square, but curly brackets, thank you. And then you assign the properties of that object. So in this example, I would just have a property A, which has the value 42. And then you end the object. And if we now call on that, it's an object with a property A that has value 42. You can also assign functions to the properties, and then we usually call them methods instead. So that's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is, again, var, name, and then new objects. And then you can assign the properties like this. So if I now invoke object B, it's basically the same as object A, but you have to use one more line to create the object with those features. And you also have the opportunity to create an object using a function. In that regard, the function is called a constructor. And yeah, I'll just show how it's done. First I will so this is a bug in the code here, because you don't say new function, you say function, and then the parameter you want to assign, and then you have this. So this usually refers to the objects that you are creating. And I will just stop there for now, but this is kind of this, damn it, it's complicated. But let's just do this for now. So now I can construct an object C with new, and then the name of the function, and then 42. So if I now invoke object C, it's the same, except you can see that instead of object, if I call on object A, you can see that it shows object and then the properties, while in object C it's constructor and then the properties. And that is because function is now an object that you have created a new object from. That is, constructor is the prototype version of the object you have created. So this has some interesting features. Well, it's kind of difficult to explain that as well. But keep in mind that everything is objects in JavaScript. So when you create a new object, a new whatever, you will always find that the prototype of that object is object. So let's see what the prototype of object C. So you can find the prototype of any objects using that name and then dot prototype. No. Sorry. This perhaps. No. Yes. So underscore underscore proto underscore underscore. Then you get the prototype, and the prototype of object C is actually objects. I have forgotten something, but yeah, everything is objects. You don't really need to know this, but it's nice to know in the future when you need to know it. But it's not really beginner stuff, so I'm sorry.
Question?
Yes.
What kind of development do you recommend?
I would recommend the first one. If you are creating simple objects. But if you want to create kind of complex objects that you want to have a lot of methods and stuff it does, I would recommend the last one, using a constructor and try to mimic a class-like behavior as you have in Java. I will also show some examples of this later on in the code. So we'll see how it goes. And last, arrays. So arrays, you have basically two ways of creating, and I've shown one already, but you have these square brackets. So this is an empty array, and you can put stuff into it. And you can also use the constructor for arrays, which is array with a big capital A, and then the parameters you want to fill it with. And if we say B, it's the same. Of these two methods, I recommend the first one. It's just much easier to understand, in my opinion, at least. With arrays, yes.
Can we associate an array to an object?
So, for example, this returns an array, but if we can also ask for the proto of the proto, and that is an object. So, with an array, you have some methods that's kind of handy to know, and that's push, pop, unshift, and shift. So if we do a push, we push a new value until on the end of the array. Yeah, I also should mention that you can put any value you want to in that array. It is not typed that either, so you can have. I can also do tests. So if I look at it now, it has three numbers and one string. And now I can also pop that array, and then I return the last element of the array, and also the array is loses that value. Now you also have unshift, which then okay, so unshift returns the new length of the variable of the array. So if I do this, I ask for the length of the variable, I get 4. And also we can see that the new array, I should give it a new value. So now we have 4, 3, 1, 2, 3. And then we can also shift that, and then we get the first element of the array. Yeah, this is basically how you manipulate arrays in JavaScript. Nice to know. So, when you know variables and function, objects, and arrays, you know the basic stuff of JavaScript. Of course, there are a lot of things you can do with all of this, and I can't really explain all of them. You just have to explore. But I will show you now how you can get your code to run in the web page. And there are 3 ways of doing this, and I also will show a 4th. That's more like a philosophy of how you can apply your JavaScript to your HTML. And I will explain the different types on the different slides. So inline code is the most easiest way of writing your JavaScript code. Is also the most ugly, so I won't recommend it doing that. But if I do this, you really can't see that all that good. But when I click the button, it shows an alert, and this was the web was notorious in the earlier days for popping up these alerts all over the place. So usually the browser asks you, do you really want to do this? You want to continue this? But in this example, we would look on the source code. So on Windows and Linux, you press Ctrl-U, and on OS X you push Command Option U. So this is a very basic HTML file, and I've put all my content in a div because I really like that you get that centered stuff, and you have to embed it in a div to do that. But apart from that, you have the title, H1. You have a aside, which is just some information that's not really part of the content, but it's nice to have, but put it somewhere else. And you have the button, you have the break tag, you have a link that goes back to the presentation, and then I have a link to my CSS that makes the example fancy. What's important here is the button and the attribute onClick. Now you can declare your JavaScript code directly in the onClick, and it will do what you told it to do. But of course, this works only for very simple code. If you write complex structures, you don't really want to put it in the onClick because it's not reusable and it's just ugly and not really debuggable at all. But if you want to do something really, really, really simple, you can do this. OnClick, alert. Now, alert is a function that just shows you the pop-up, and you give it a string that tells you what to show in that. So I guess one thing I actually should show here is that you have different ways of declaring a string. You can do, I have to give the name. You can do like this, like I've done for now, but you can also do this. And they are very kind of the same. So, next way of including your JavaScript in an HTML is using the script tag. So if I click this, I will get a pop-up that's invoked with confirm, I think it's called. You can look at the source code now, and it's just some text, and then you can say either OK or cancel, and when you click that, it will return true or false. So if you look at the console here, if I do this again, are you sure? Cancel, it turns false. So if you want to have something really simple, are you certain you want to delete this thing? You can pop a confirm. Now, if you look at the source code for this, again, we have a div with role main, we have a title, we have a side, and the button. Now, in the button, we call on a function that is declared elsewhere. So it's declared here in a script tag. And usually you have to write script type text JavaScript, but in HTML5 you don't need to do that. So you just write scripts, and then you have your JavaScript code. And it will invoke that function. So what I've done here is you have a variable with the name answer, and it's assigned the value that is returned from confirm. This is either true or false. And then I use console.log, which is a way of outputting that value to my console in the browser. So if your browser supports console, it usually will support this API, console.log. So that's why we get the output here in our console. I will use that a lot, so yep.
Is it confirmed that makes that you get the cancel and OK button?
Yeah. So you can't, like, if you want to have something else than OK and cancel, you can't do that on the confirm. Then you have to create your own pop-up, basically. You have a lot of libraries doing that for you as well, but it's usually called modal window. Yeah. So that's the second way of including your JavaScript. The third way is to include JavaScript as a JS file, and that's I will just show actually the code, the source code first. What you do then is you have the script tag, but you also have the source attributes referring to your JS file, and that you can declare that wherever you want in your HTML file. There are some pitfalls to remember when doing it, but I will explain them when doing the more heavy code examples later on. But we can look at that JS file, and it basically does the same as earlier. It has var and then name of the variable, and it declares as a function. And in this example, we have used prompt, which is a pop-up where you can get a value from the user. You can write something. I'll show you. And then we just output that something to the console. So if we open the console, I invoke. So write something is a string that I put in. And I will just write test because I'm really boring. I'm not creative when it comes to this stuff. And it outputs that into the console. Now, if we just look at this source code again, we see that we still have JavaScript in our HTML. So the JavaScript is still part of the code. And there are some Puritans, I guess, some people that don't really like that. They want something that is called progressive enhancement, which means that if your user don't support JavaScript, you will still show something, but the functionality won't be there. But the functionality should be implemented in such a way that it enhances the user experience. Of course, I would say a lot of applications, a lot of web pages don't function at all if you do it like this. But you have a usual solution is that you have like what's the word? A fallback solution. For example, Gmail. If it sees that you use a really long time to load the JavaScript file or something is broken, you are given a choice to load a fallback solution that doesn't use any JavaScript at all. And it hasn't the finesse and the dynamic behavior of the normal Gmail web page, but it works. It has the basic functionality there. So how can we do this? In this example, I have 3 buttons that uses a function called set timeouts and set interval. Set timeouts is basically a function that takes a function as its first parameter, and then you tell it how long it should wait until it calls on that function. And that value is given in milliseconds. So I will just show you the code. So this is an HTML file that is a bit more valid. It's a bit better, but it also has a lot more code. In this example, I have put time.js, which contains our code, in the head tag of the HTML file. So this is the code in its full view, and set timeout is used here. So you see we declare a function which just console log timeout completed, and then I tell how many milliseconds that it should wait, and this is then 2 seconds. So if we do that, we have to open the console log. We start set timeout. Timeout started, and then 2 seconds, timeout completed. Now, interval is basically the same as set timeout, except it will call the function every time you hit that millisecond. So every 2 seconds it will call. So this is the set interval. Every 2 seconds it will log to the console interval check-in. Yeah, I will explain more of this. It also has some other features of JavaScript that's kind of difficult to grasp the first time. But if we look at the console, as start interval, and it starts, and a check-in, and a check-in, and we can stop it, and now interval stopped, and now it should not check in anymore. Yes, that's good. And the way that is handled is that we tell the interval to stop, and that is done by calling clear interval with the function that the name of the variable that we assign the set interval to. So this example here, var interval and then whole other stuff. Ignore the document get element by ID for now. It's not important. But what is important, that is we declare the variable interval outside of these function bodies, so that they get access to that variable. And this is called closures. So you have variables that are declared outside of the function, but they are reachable. The function can reach them because they are part of the closure that is defined for that function. And this is also this is the reason why you should be really careful when you work with global variables, because a global variable is accessible to all the codes in your web page. So if you give a name to your function and someone else in another library uses that exact name and they have also used a global variable, that's going to crash. And believe me, that is really difficult to debug. Why does this not work? And you have used like 10 third-party libraries and you just don't understand why it doesn't work. So closures are really powerful, but they also hell if you start losing track of them. So the way we prevent using global variables is that we declare the variables within a function scope of closure that we control. And in this example, I have done that by assigning a function to window.unload. Now, window is an object that is always implemented in browsers. It basically represents the window that you have. So in this, like in this page, if I invoke window, is an object, and that is accessible in all browsers, even older browsers. And what I've done, so window has a set of properties that you can assign, and one of them is unload. You need to assign a function to unload, and that function will be called whenever the window or the web page is finished loading. Finish loading the DOM tree of the HTML file. And I won't, maybe I should go into DOM actually. So you've seen the HTML file. Now browsers, they convert that HTML into a DOM tree. And that is basically a representation of your HTML file that can be manipulated. So when that DOM tree is constructed, it's ready to do something with, we tell that it should load this function. Now, we also have dispute, which is document, which is also accessible in all browsers, and it represents handy methods to manipulate your DOM tree. So once we have loaded our DOM tree, we can call on getElementById. Now, ID is something we can put on our tags. So on our buttons, I have button ID start timeout, button ID start interval, button ID stop interval. Now, these elements are accessible, reachable, using those document getElementById. And you also have getElementBy class name and getElementByTag. But IDs should only be represented once in an HTML file. So we know, well, we kind of know that we only get one result from this function. Now, what I could do is that I could assign the result of document.getElementById to a variable, and then I could call on a method that's available on that variable. But I'm not going to reuse that variable in any other places here, so I can just call on the add event listener, which is a method on this on the DOM object that's returned by this method, and I can tell it that whenever somebody clicks on this element, you should run this function. So that's a mouthful, but the result is that we don't have any JavaScript in the HTML at all. The only JavaScript related thing we have here is the reference to the JavaScript file. So if you want to have if you want to split your HTML apart from your JavaScript, this is how you can do it. Yes. Any questions?
What will happen if you try to include two JavaScript things and both of them are doing something on the node?
Then the browser will use the last declaration of window.onload. I think. Yeah, quite certain of it. We can try it actually. Let's open our time.js. So this is the same JS file that I showed you with this source code. So you have it here, and you also have it here. Now, if I, on the end of this file, put in onload function, yeah, whatever, console log test. Now, what happens if we... So it runs tests, but it should also... Yeah, so now it doesn't... we don't have access to... the other function isn't called. It's only the last function that is called using this. Okay, Martin?
I was wondering, don't use classes at all in this?
Classes?
Yes.
No, not really.
Because I looked at some Unreal Engine code and that uses classes, so I'm confused.
Yeah, class, how to explain this? Class is a protected entity token in JavaScript. So you can't say var class something, then JavaScript actually will tell you that you're doing something illegal. Well, the browser will tell you that you're doing something illegal. And in older browsers, you can't use it, but I think in newer browsers that supports the latest version of JavaScript, that is ECMAScript 6, will support it. So there are different versions of JavaScript, Usually you have backward compatibility. So you have ECMAScript 3, ECMAScript 5, and ECMAScript 6, which is also called Harmony. ECMAScript 3 is what like the basic JavaScript that's supported by all browsers. ECMAScript 5 is usually part of what we call HTML5. So if you like IE8, the culprit of them all, supports usually don't support ECMAScript 5, and they at least don't support ECMAScript 6. And usually newer browsers don't support ECMAScript 6, but you have nightly builds and like Canary version of Chrome that supports it. And you also have libraries like what's the name again? I will actually come back to it later. But there are like shivs and shims that makes it possible for you. But you really shouldn't rely on using the class token in JavaScript. You have to use the other like constructors and other ways of creating objects. Now, just to complicate it a little bit further, you do have class in CoffeeScript, which functions as class in Java or Python and stuff like that. So it may be that maybe you've seen class like from CoffeeScripts. Then it's then compiled to JavaScript that has class-like behavior, but isn't really a class. I don't know. It's coming. The class token is gonna be available maybe in 2-3 years time, like in broad scale. But for now, we really can't rely on it, so you shouldn't use it unless, of course, you have your own little project that nobody else is gonna touch. Okay, that was a lot, and it's not getting very much smaller because now I'm going to implement a clock using different ways, different libraries. But first I will implement it using only JavaScripts, and I say only because I will use a library called Moment, because date manipulation in JavaScript is horrible. I hate it, and Moment has a really good way of handling dates and time and stuff like that. So I will use that. I will loop a little bit too faster. So I have created a template for this implementation. It looks like this, and the file for now is empty. It doesn't have anything. So this is simply HTML that has this reference to moment here, and then the JS file, and then some CSS, and then you know the standard stuff. And then I have a div with ID clock. Best practice is actually having IDs with capital letters in the beginning, but I forgot that here, so never mind. Yeah, and as you see, clock should show here, as this is a final implementation. So this is how it should work. But if we go back to this, I will go over to my clock.js file here. So if we just write console log tests, and if we refresh this page, yeah, it shows tests. This is an annoying bug because I have some extension to my browser. I should have started this presentation in incognito mode, but yeah, it's not that big a problem. Okay, so we already have we already touched a method, a function that enables us to count in time, and that is set interval. So let's just declare that set interval. You give it a function, and now it just logs to the console test. So if I will just have this open, yeah, okay, so that's gonna go crazy. I should have, of course, said how long it should wait for each. You're gonna get a memory problem if you would continue doing that for a long time. So this would just output tests, nothing fancy. Now, if I actually wanted to use just dates, JavaScript supports the date objects, and I could do like this, and it would the default toString methods outputs this horrible thing here. I could so this is the same as doing this. Most objects have this toString method. That's just the same thing. So if you try to, I can actually to show this. I will just so to show how this can be manipulated. So you remember if I declare objects with property 42. I hope this works. I'm not too sure. If you now call on toString on that, I will get the type of the objects. Now I think I can assign these methods with something completely different. It's a function that returns, hey. Yep, so if I now do toString, so that's how you basically mess up with JavaScript default behavior. You can do this to any objects you want, but tread carefully because you could break a lot of behavior in your web page or your instance of that web page. Okay. So I told you that I use moments, and the way I call that is moments, call as a function, and then it returns an object that has a method called format, and I can tell which format of the time that moments controls for me that it should have. So actually, let's just do this now, and you can see it logs objects with a lot of. So if yeah, there's a lot of stuff here. Pro has all the different methods. So if I then do formats HMMSS, do this, yay, we have a clock in the console. But I want to put that in the ID clock here. So we need to get that elements by documents, get elements by ID clock. So what do you think this, nope, not this, this thing logs? I usually think it would output the objects that's in the div here. So actually, if I in Chrome, if you look at, you can actually see where on the web page that object is. Now I can, if I'm not completely wrong, I can say inner HTML, which is the content of that element, and then I can do this. And if I remember correctly, this is actually won't work. Yes. So I just have to look quickly on this. Damn it. Of course I've got others actually. Just give me a second. Yes. So, this is one of the pitfalls of JavaScript, and I always forget this, of course. So, we can get that element, this div ID, because it has been created, but it's not really complete to do anything with it. It's not really can't really be manipulated. So what we want to do is actually have a variable called start time, which does this thing, and we want to tell our HTML to load that function when it has loaded the DOM tree. So I think this should work better. Oh, I have something wrong. So it will, the browser will put out what went wrong. Function, not function. So that should have worked. Damn it. I hate it. This always happens when you have a presentation and you have live coding. And let's see here. So var clock document get element by ID. I do like that. And then I'm cheating. This clock inner HTML should. That should be censored from the screencasts. Just give me a second. Document get element by ID. And let's debugging while live coding is always fun, of course, especially for you guys. Han skrev noe feil. Onload start time, div either clock. Aha! Yes, very good. Okay, so another pitfall in JavaScript, remembering the names of functions. Yes, thank you. But as you see here, it takes a second before it actually does that. So we actually have to run this function at once. We do that like this. Yeah, it takes until we actually load the DOM, it will not show the change. And of course, do this a bit more nicer. We can have its own function, so that we only do this once, and we don't want to use closure in this case. So we give it a parameter clock, and then we can give that value there, and we can do update time clock. So yes. So this is like a pure HTML implementation. If I didn't want to use moment, I would have to do stuff like new date, and then get hours and get minutes, and that only returns the number of hour or minutes. So if I wanted to have like, if it was like 7 minutes over 5, it would only give 5:5 directly instead of 0:7. So I would have a lot of function just checking that format, and it's just not fun. So that's why we use moments. Okay. Next, let's use Jquery. Jquery is a very popular JavaScript library to manipulate the DOM, and it's I would say quite easy to use. Jquery is mostly recognizable because it uses dollar sign, yes. So if you see $sign somewhere in someone's code, they probably use Jquery. So for this code, I have I have basically the same setup. HTML file with role main clock, and then the ID clock, and then I have the moment like I did before, and then I have Jquery, and then my JS file. So let's open this file, and we start Jquery by, that was not what I wanted. Right. I'm not that familiar with the Mac here, so. And one handy feature Jquery has is that you can actually call on a function like this, and that is basically the same as window onload, except that actually in this case you can give it multiple functions that will run each. So this will log tests when the DOM is loaded, and we can, another nice feature that Jquery has, which is the main feature, is that you can, let's wait for this. Okay, so var clock equals, and then Jquery, and then you can give the CSS selector of that element. So I don't know how familiar you are with CSS, but the way to refer to an element with ID clock in CSS is by using hashtag clock. So if we see what this does, it should return a Jquery object that refers to the clock, the element with ID clock. Yes. So if we open this, you can see that this refers to the clock that we have there. So if we want to manipulate the clock, we can write text, which I think is a method, and then the value we want to manipulate it with. So if we do moment format HMMS, it should give us this time. And of course, if we want to do, no, let's use set timeouts, and I will show you another handy feature that JavaScript supports. And that is, we have to, okay, so update time, which takes nothing. Sorry, it's a function, and that is what does this. And of course, we can, since you're only going to use it once, we can use this, and then we can set timeouts, update time, which tells us that after 1 second it should do that. Actually, we can also do this. So we say we update time at once, and then each time update time function is called, it initiates another set timeout. So it becomes a recursive function that calls on itself every second. So that's also how we can implement a clock. So I guess if you look at clock, the Jquery implementation and the Jquery JavaScript implementation and the Jquery implementation, they're not that different. But in bigger, larger, complex applications, you will save a lot of time just getting your DOM elements with a Jquery and CSS selector on that element, instead of doing this document get element by ID or document get element by class. Because in addition to supporting these simple CSS selectors, it also supports a lot of others. You can say, if I had ID clock and I had like timer element with class timer, I could use that here, and that's just really difficult using this document get element by ID. Yeah, that's what I will show you when it comes to jQuery. It's just really handy when it comes to DOM manipulation. Now, the last implementation I will do with, oh, a question first.
Is it any reason that you are not using the set interval? Is your
Since you set timeout in the last example, not really. It really depends on what you want, what you are familiar with. Nice thing about set interval is that when you call on something with set interval, the set interval function will return an object that you can then tell stop the interval. So you could have a button that said stop the clock, and you can also then have start the clock. So you could, it's easier to manipulate. As with using set timeout, it does the same, but it would be more difficult to handle in your code. It would not look as neat. But really depends on your user case. So Angularjs is a MVC framework, that is Model View Controller. It handles DOM manipulation for you, so you don't really think about DOM manipulation when working with Angular, unless you implement directives, but I will not do that here. The point is that with Angular, every value, everything is handled by something called model, and the model is like the source of truth, and that source can then be shown wherever you want it in your HTML. So I think it's easier to understand when I implement it. So same setup, I will open the Angular HTML, same HTML, we refer to Angular here, and we have our empty Angular file here. So when you use Angular, you have to declare you have to implement some attributes in your HTML code. One of them is ng-app, which tells Angular which part of your HTML you want a given app to control. You can also not give it a name to the app at all, in which case the whole thing is one scope, one model. And the really nice thing you can do then is that you have like an input which allows the user to write something, and you can say ng-model, which is an object that you name. So I will say test, and we can show that, and the way you then output that is with curly brackets, thank you, and the name of that variable model. So if I now refresh this, I can write stuff, and it updates at once. And this is very, very handy in many cases. So, but we don't want to take input from the user. We want to output something that we tell it outputs. in our case, the clock. So the way we do this is that we have an ng app. We name that app clock app, and then we have so that we have clock app. We have that. We then define that app using Angular module. So the Angular here is still like the global object for Angular. It has a method module that we then give the name of the app. It's the same thing we had in the front end. And then the second parameter is dependencies that that app has. In this case, it's an empty array because we have no dependencies. And yeah, that's how you tie the JS and the HTML together. Now, in addition, we have controllers in Angular, and the way you tell your HTML code that this is where your controller should do something is with ng-controller. So we have clock controller. And the way you declare that is with Angular module. Then you have controller on that module. You could also do this var clock app equals. So we return the app to that variable, and then we can assign a new controller as clock controller. And then the second parameter is then the function that is the constructor function for that controller. So if you now console log tests, this should output tests. Now, an object that is available for all controllers is something called the scope. And the scope is the model that is under the hood, if you want, is what refers to. So if I say scope, scope tests, should be tests, it outputs test to it. So now we can actually do what we have done before. Set interval function for every second. I have worked on a Windows computer today, so my fingers are not synced to the Mac here. We can do scope tests. Let's call this sure. Let's call this clock instead of tests. So the clock scope clock is then equal moments format hour minutes seconds. Of course, it takes. Did I write something wrong? Ah, yes. This is another pitfall. But let's just put this. Let's output this at once, and just. So this is how comments work in JavaScript files. You have line comments, and then you can have block comments like this. Right. This is comments. This is not done. So just for your convenience, the developers. So if we do this, yes, it outputs the clock. But if we do this, it doesn't update. So why doesn't it update? We need to tell Angular when to update the model that is viewed, that is displayed on in the HTML, the DOM. Because if we do console log the updated time, you can actually see that the console is updated. But we need to explicitly tell the DOM to be updated with this value. do. And the way we do that is using scope apply. Now, the way this works is that it will run the function that you give it, and then it will call another function called digest, and digest is what triggers the update of the HTML. And I did close this, so I'll just get back to the here. So this should now, why doesn't it work? Still outputs. This hasn't been updated. Why I have not? Sorry. I logged instead of updating it. So now, yes, it's updated. And of course, if you compare Angular implementation with Jquery implementation, is actually longer, and that's because you have more boilerplate code for Angular. But again, if you work with large applications and you need this kind of feature that you have your model and you have your controllers and you have your views, then you really should look into Angular, because when it comes to it, it handles your code very neatly. It has a nice structure of how you divide your code into different behaviors and features. So yeah. So that's the end of my coding session, which has lasted long enough. So some final tips. Developer toolbar is your friend. It's very handy to debug your application using the developer toolbar. You have a lot of tools in the developer toolbar, apart from the elements that show your DOM tree actually represented like the HTML code. You also have tons of other stuff, so really check into that. You have a extension to Chrome that's that enables you to look at like the scope, the model, stuff like that. I really can't remember the name of it now, but just search for Chrome Angular extension. This is the first one. It's very handy. Use the source. Whenever you see something that is cool, view the codes. Most web pages have an open code, so you can copy and paste whatever you want. And of course, it takes some time to actually find that little function that the page has, because it probably has a lot of other functions as well. But you can learn a lot just by looking at what other people have done. And also, this is not just for JavaScript, but I recommend you to learn TDD, test-driven development. It's very hard in the beginning, because I guess most of you that have programmed some applications, usually you write something and then you run the code and you see what happens. This is another way of coding that when you come into it is just a lot better. It gives much more stability to your codes. Of course, it's not that important for small hobby projects. Like this presentation doesn't have any tests, so do not use the presentation as a good example of that. And if you want to learn TDD, I can recommend Zombie TDD, which is several videos of a Norwegian developer explaining how he has implemented a game in the browser using TDD. It's very good. And also, if you want some links that is good, some web pages that is good to have like in your RSS feed reader or whatever, I can recommend Daily.js. Every day you get something new from JavaScript. HTML5 Rocks is very good. It's I think it's Google that supplies most of the articles there. It showcases like cutting edge JavaScript features. A list apart also has a lot of other stuff like CSS and HTML and how you should do front-end stuff, but also a lot of JavaScript, so that's very much recommended. And if you want to read a book, you should read JavaScript, The Good Parts. It's written by Douglas Crockford, who has a lot of good things to say about JavaScript and how you should structure your JavaScript code. So that's me. That's what I have.